格差、失業、金融危機、経済の問題が絶えない現実の世界。今、経済学の外から新しい視点を提示する若き知性が注目されている。歴史家でありジャーナリストでもあるオランダ人ルトガー・ブレグマン。
Politicians from the left to the right and journalists from the left to the right nowadays are still obsessed with the idea of economic growth, of GDP, because that's how we define and measure economic growth. Not many people know that the concept of GDP was invented in the 1930s by a Russian-American economist called Simon Kuznets. And when he presented the concept to the American Congress, at that time he said, don't ever use this as a measure of progress. You know, don't do it. And if you do, then at least subtract all spending on the military, subtract all spending on advertising, and subtract all spending on the banking sector, because that doesn't add anything of value. Now, here we are. If you want to measure progress, GDP is probably the worst concept you could use. Because, you know, every time when for example, a disaster hits, like a few years ago, the terrible disaster hit Japan, that was great for GDP. You know, because a lot of things had to be rebuilt, etc. So the economy was growing as never before. So that was great. If you ask an economist, more disasters. It's always good for GDP. Obviously, we need to rethink what progress is. We need to rethink what growth is. And in that sense, sure, I'm not against measuring. You can also always measure things. But what I'd say is, let's build a dashboard of all kind of different indicators. Let's look at the happiness of our society. Let's look at how meaningful the jobs are that people think they have. Let's look at the rate of depressions. Let's look at the amount of stress people have, the amount of social capital we have, etc., etc. Let's look at all these indicators and let's have a proper debate about it. You know, what so often happens nowadays is that politicians hide behind the numbers. They say, look, GDP is growing, I've done my job. That's it, vote for me. Well, that's not good enough, because if you ask an economist what is productivity, he'd say, well, productivity is just the amount of money you earn. But that's crazy. I mean, that means that, for example, a flash trader who's works on Wall Street, for example, and doing absolutely useless work, you know, just buying shares, selling them a few milliseconds later, well, that's absolutely socially useless, earns you a lot of money. That means that he or she would be really productive. Why? You know, that doesn't seem right. And it also means that if you do incredibly valuable volunteers work, again, caring for the elderly, that wouldn't be productive. Well, that's weird. So I think we also need to look at the kind of indicators we're using. And so often nowadays, we're being deluded by, in mainstream journalism, so often that people say, oh, GDP does this, GDP does that. My advice is, every time you hear the word GDP, turn off the TV.
物から情報、サービスへと経済の中心が移りゆく時代。物質ではなくアイデアが付加価値を生む。GDP はどこまで現実を捉えられるのか。数字でカウントされる経済の向こうにどんな社会を思い描けるのか。
First thing that I think we need to understand is that if you look at the state of the world right now from a historical perspective, is that we've achieved a lot. You know, in the past 200 years, we've become incredibly wealthy, healthy, we've become much smarter actually. And I understand that people don't get that from the news. I mean, the news is always about things that go wrong, and journalists always focus on the exceptions, corruption, violence, terrorism. But I mean, my job as a historian is to zoom out and to show the bigger picture. And then actually what we've seen is, for example, the decline of extreme poverty. You know, it was 84% in 1820, and now it's under 10%. So that's pretty big, actually. But it's also important to remember that we're not there yet. So on a global scale, almost 1 billion people still live in extreme poverty. Well, there's still poverty in Japan. child poverty, for example, about 16% of all children living in poverty. I think that's an incredible shame. You know, no kids should grow up in poverty, especially in rich countries.
明確なビジョンを描きにくいこの時代、ブレグマンが著書「隷属なき道」で主張するのがベーシックインカムの採用だ。歴史に埋もれたある秘話を語る。
This is a really bizarre episode of American history. Almost no one knows this, but Richard Nixon almost implemented a basic income, a mother's basic income, at the beginning of the 70s in the United States. And almost everyone believed back then that some form of basic income was going to be implemented. So, for example, John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous left-wing economist, he was in favor of it. But Milton Friedman, the neoliberal right-wing economist, was also in favor of it. So they all agreed that we should do this. And Nixon said, all right, let me be the president, I'll do it, no problem. His proposal for a basic income got through the House of Representatives twice. And then it hit the Senate floor, where the Democrats said, sure, we want basic income as well, but we want a higher basic income. So they voted against it. That's what happened twice, actually. And then even more bizarre, what happened in 1978 is that the results from a basic income experiment in Seattle came in. And again, the results were really positive. So healthcare costs went down, crime went down, kids performed much better in school, people didn't stop working. But there was another thing that they found out, and that is that the divorce rates went up by 50%. So at that point, all the Republicans, all the conservatives, they said, you know, we can't have basic income. You know, this will make women much too independent. You know, now they can leave all their crappy marriages. We don't want that. And that's when basic income was pretty much forgotten in the US. It was only 10 years later that researchers found out that a statistical mistake had been made. So in reality, the divorce rate did not go up at all. But at that point, it was already too late. So it's a pretty bizarre history full of coincidences. And I am quite convinced that if the US would have implemented a basic income, that would have been hugely influential. And that many more governments around the globe would have been interested in the idea as well. And in that sense, I don't think we have to wait for the robots or anything before we can implement basic income. We can do it right now. Actually, we should have done it 40 years ago. For me, one of the biggest lessons of history is that things could be different. You know, if you don't zoom out, if you're focused on the news, on what's happening right now, so often people are pessimistic, so often people are cynical and think, oh, this is the only way that we can organize society and things will never change. But if you just zoom out a little bit or travel around to different countries, well, you soon get the impression that there are many, many ways to construct the societies. There are many, many ways of living. And this is not the only one we're doing right now. That's why I really try to use historical examples in the book. You know, so often just philosophy alone doesn't convince people. You know, you can speculate about anything you want. But what does convince people is actual stories. You know, of a time when they did an actual experiment and they did eradicate poverty and it did work. That's the kind of stories we should be telling to each other.